Welcome to Zwemer Theological Seminary. We are going to be looking today at the life of the great Protestant reformer Theodor Beza. Theodor Beza was born on the June the 24th, 1519 and died October 13, 1605. He was a French Protestant and Christian theologian, a scholar and a writer, and a man who had a great influence in his time. Theodor Beza was born at Versailles in Burgundy, France. His father was a royal governor at Versailles, descended from the Burgundian family of distinction, and his mother was Marie Berdelot, was known for her generosity. Beza's fathers had two brothers, Nicholas, who was a member of Parliament at Paris, and Claude, who was abbot of the Cistercian monastery in Fromont in the Diocese of Beauvais. Nicholas was unmarried during a visit to Versailles, was so pleased with Theodore that, with permission of his parents, he took him to Paris to educate him. There from Paris, Theodore was sent to Orleans in December 1528 to receive instruction from the famous teacher Zwemer. He was received into Zwemer's house, and it was seen like a second birthday. Young Beza soon followed his teacher to Bourges, where the later was called by the Duchess Marguerite of Angoulême, sister of Francis I. At that time, Bourges was the focus of the Reformation movement in France, and in 1534, after Francis I issued his edict against ecclesiastical innovations, Zwemer returned to Germany. Beza, in accordance with the wishes of his father, went back to Orleans to study law and spent 4 years there, 1535 to 39. Beza pursued law, even though it had little attraction for him, but he enjoyed reading the great ancient classics such as Ovid, etc. Beza received his degree in law on August 11, 1539, and on his father's desire he went to Paris, where he began to practice. To support him, his relatives obtained for him 2 benefices, of which proceeded to amount of about 700 gold crowns a year, and his uncle promised to make him his successor. Beza spent 2 years in Paris and gained a prominent position in literary circles. To escape the many temptations to which he had to deal with the knowledge of 2 friends, he became engaged in 1544 to a lady of humble means, Claudia de Noci, promising to publicly marry her as soon as his circumstances would allow it. In 1548, Beza published his Latin poetry, Juvenilia, and it's interesting to note that Beza was a rounded kind of man. He was a man who not only wrote theology, but he could write poetry and plays. His Latin poem made him famous, and he was widely considered one of the best writers of Latin poetry of his time. Some cautioned against reading biographical details in his writings, such as Philip Chaff, who argued that you can read too much into his poems as if he had done things wrong, which he had not. But I think that you have to read the poems for yourself and work out the details there about his life and what you think about his life. Shortly after the publication of his book, he fell ill, and his illness, it is reported, revealed to him his spiritual needs. Gradually he came to accept salvation in Christ, and this lifted his heart and gave him new strength to cope with in life. He resolved to sever some of his connections and went to Geneva, the French city that housed the evangelicals, or some would say the adherents to the Reformation. Beza was received by John Calvin, who had met him already at Zwemer's house and was married in the church. Beza was at a loss for immediate occupation, so he went to Tübingen to see his former teacher Wulmer. On his way home, he visited Pierre Verret at Lausanne, who brought about his appointment as professor of Greek at the academy there in 1549. Beza found time to write his drama Abraham Sacrifiant, in which he contrasted Catholicism with Protestantism, and the work was well received. In June 1551, he added a few psalms to the French version of the psalms begun by Clement Marot, and was also very successful. About the same time, he published Pasavantius, a satire directed against Pierre Lisette, the former president of the Parliament of Paris and a principal originator of the Fiery Chamber, who at the time in 1551 was abbot of Saint Victor near Paris, and publishing a number of polemical writings. Of a more serious character were two controversies in which Beza was involved in at this time. The first concerned the doctrine of predestination, and the controversy with Calvin with Jerome Bolzec. The second referred to the burning of Michael Severitus at Geneva on October 27, 1553. In defense of Calvin and the Geneva magistrates, Beza published 1554 the work De Hereticus Civili Magistra Poneiadis is translated into French in 1560. In 1557, Beza took a special interest in the Waldeans of Piedmont, who were being harassed by the French government. On their behalf, he went with William Farel to Bern, Zurich, Basel, and other places to gain support. Beza and Farel made a declaration concerning the Waldensian views on the sacrament on May 14, 1557. The written declaration clearly stated their position and was well received by the Lutheran theologians, but was strongly disapproved of in Bern and Zurich. In the autumn of 1558, Beza undertook a second journey with Farel to Worms by way of Strasbourg, in the hope of bringing about the intercession by the evangelical prince of the empire in favour of the persecuted brethren at Paris. With Melkinen and other theologians then assembled at Colloquy of Worms, Beza proposed a union of Protestant Christians, but the proposal was decidedly rejected. False reports reached the German princes that the hostilities against the Huguenots in France had ceased and no embassy was sent to the court of France. As a result, Beza undertook another journey with Farel and a few others to Strasbourg and Frankfurt, where the sending of an embassy to Paris was resolved upon. Beza returned to Lausanne, and he was greatly disturbed. In union with many ministers and professors in the city and country, Verret at last thought of establishing a consistory of introducing a church discipline which should apply excommunication, especially at the celebration of the communion. But the Bern would have no Calvinistic church government, and this caused many difficulties, and Beza thought it best in 1558 to settle at Geneva. At Geneva, he was the chair of Greek in the newly established academy after Calvin's death, also of theology. He was also obliged to preach. He completed the version of Pierre Olivetan's translation of the New Testament, began some years before, and it was a great testament to his scholarship. In 1559, he undertook another journey in the interest of the Huguenots, this time at Heidelberg. At about the same time, he had to defend against Calvin against Joachim Westphal in Hamburg and Tillemann Hessius. More important than this, his polemical activity was Beza's statement of his own confession. It was originally prepared for his father in justification of his action and published in a revised form to promote evangelical knowledge among Beza's countrymen. It was printed in Latin in 1560 with the dedication to Wulmer. An English translation was published at London in 1563, and it was published also in Italian, Dutch and German. Things were rapidly changing, however, from about 1560 to 63. It seemed that things were going to get better. King Anthony of Navarre, yielding to the urgent request of the evangelical nobleman, declared his willingness to listen to a prominent teacher of the church, Beza, a French nobleman and head of the academy in the metropolis of French Protestantism, was invited to the castle at Nerac, but he could not plant the seed of evangelical faith in the heart of the king. In the year following, in 1561, Beza represented the evangelicals at the colloquy of Poissy, and in a tremendous sermon he defended the principles of the evangelical faith. The colloquy was without result, but Beza, at the head and advocate of the Reformed congregations of France, was revered and hated by many. The Queen insisted upon another meeting, which was opened at Saint-Germain on January 28, 1562, and 11 days after the proclamation of the famous January Edict, which granted important privileges to those of the Reformed faith. But the meeting was broken off when it became evident that the Catholic party was preparing to overthrow Protestantism. Beza hastily issued a circular to all Reformed congregations of the empire, and with Condé and his troops went to Orleans. It was necessary to proceed quickly and energetically, but there were neither soldiers nor money, and the request of Condé, Beza visited all Huguenot cities to obtain both. He also wrote a manifesto in which he argued the justice of the Reformed cause. As one of the messengers to collect soldiers and money among the religionists, Beza was appointed to visit England, Germany and Switzerland. He went to Strasbourg and Basel, but met with failure. He then returned to Geneva, which he reached September 4th. He had hardly been there 14 days when he was called once more to Orleans by d'Andelot. The campaign was becoming more successful, but the publication of the unfortunate Edict of Pacification, which Condé accepted in March 12, 1563, filled many in the Protestant camp, as well as Beza, with tremendous horror. For 22 months Beza had been absent from Geneva, and the interest of school and church there, especially the condition of Calvin, made it necessary for him to return. For there was no one to take place of Calvin, who was sick and unable longer to bear the burden resting on him. Calvin and Beza arranged to perform their duties jointly in alternate weeks, but the death of Calvin occurred soon afterwards in May 27, 1564. As a result of the matter, of course, Beza was his successor. Until 1580, Beza was not only moderator, but also the real soul of the great institution of learning at Geneva, which Calvin had founded in 1559, consisting of a gymnasium and an academy. As long as he lived, Beza was interested in higher education. The Protestant youth for nearly 40 years thronged his lecture room to hear his theological lectures, in which he expounded the purest Calvinistic orthodoxy. As a counsellor, he was listened to by both magistrates and pastors, and Geneva indebted to him from the founding of a law school in which Francis Hotman, Julius Passius and Denis Godefroy, the most eminent jurists of the century, lectured in turn. As Calvin's successor, Beza was, to say at the very least, very successful, not only in carrying out his work, but in bringing unity in Geneva. The magistrates had taken on Calvin's ideas, spurred on by Beza. Beza didn't push his will upon the people, and took no harsh measures against the injudicious or hot-headed colleagues, though sometimes he took their cases in hand and acted as mediator, and yet he often experienced opposition so extreme that he threatened to resign. Although he was inclined to take the part of the magistrates, he knew how to defend the rights and independence of the spiritual power when occasion arose, without ever conceding to the opposition's influences, as Calvin had to at some times. Beza's activity was tremendous. He mediated between church work and the magistracy. He also was asked many questions, political questions, by the political elite of his time. He corresponded with leaders of the Reformed Party in Europe, and after the St. Bartholomew's massacre in 1572, he used his influence to give to the refugees an hospitable reception at Geneva. In 1574, he wrote Rights of Magistrates, in which he emphatically protested against tyranny in religious matters, and affirmed that it is legitimate for people to oppose an unworthy magistracy in practical manner and, if necessary, to use weapons and to depose them. We could say that Beza had many great qualities. He was a great humanist, a great exegete, a great orator. He was a great religious man, able in political affairs, and was a great leader of the Calvinists of Europe. He acquitted himself in controversy, and he showed sometimes he did show some irritation and intolerance, from which Bernardo Acino, pastor of the Italian congregation at Zurich, and Sebastian Castello at Basel had especially to suffer. But with the Reformed Church, it continued to maintain a strong purpose because of Beza's leadership. He was the moderator of the General Synod, which met in April 1571. In 1572, he took an important part in the National Synod at Nimes, and he was also interested in the controversies concerning the Augsburg Confession in Germany, especially after 1564, on the doctrine of the person of Christ and the sacrament, and published several works against Wisfenel, Hessian, Seleneker, Johannes Brenz, and Jacob Andrea. This made him, especially after 1571, hated by many who adhered to Lutheranism. The last great conflict of Beza encountered him with the Lutherans in March 4th, 14th to 27th, 1586, to which he had been invited by the Lutheran Count Frederick of Württemberg, at the wish of the French-speaking and Reformed residents, as well as the French noblemen who had fled to Montbelgard. As a matter of course, the intended union, which was the purpose of the meeting, was not brought about. Nevertheless, it called for serious developments within the Reformed Church. When the edition of the Acts of the meeting, as prepared by Jacob Andrea, was published, Samuel Huber of Berg near Bern, who belonged to the Lutheranizing faction of the Swiss clergy, took so great offence at the Sublapsarian doctrine of the predestination propounded by Beza and Musculus that he felt it to be his duty to denounce Musculus to the magistrates of Bern as an innovator in doctrine. To adjust the matter, the magistrates arranged another meeting between Huber and Musculus on September the 2nd, 1587, in which the former represented the universalism, the later the particularism of grace. At the great meeting, a debate was arranged at Bern in April 15 to 18 to 1588, at which the defence of the accepted system of doctrine was at the start put in the Beza's hands. The three delegates of the Helvetic cantons who presided at the debate declared in the end that Beza had substantiated the teaching propounded at Montbelgard as the orthodox one, and Huber was dismissed from his office. After that time, Beza's activity was confined more and more to more of the localities of his home place. His faithful wife died childless in 1588, and a few days before he went to Bern disputation. They had lived over 40 years together. He contracted, on the advice of his friend, a second marriage with Catherine del Piano. When he was 65 years of age, he declined rapidly in health, but was still active in teaching until 1597. One of the saddest times of Beza's was the conversion of King Henry IV to Catholicism in spite of his most earnest exhortations in 1593. How do we sum up Beza's life? Well, we can sum it up in the area of his writing. As one said, he wrote poetry, he wrote historical writings, and he also wrote plays. even one of his plays is put on today. But he also surpassed himself in theological works, much more than his humanistic and historical writings. Beza was a tremendous pupil of Calvin's, and he taught the doctrine of predestination perhaps more logically, much more than his predecessor Calvin. Beza had a pastoral heart, and much of his work reflects that pastor's heart. And one can never forget Beza's Greek New Testament. Issued in 1565, the Greek New Testament, with parallel columns to the text of the Vulgate, was a monument to great scholarship of the time. What are the lessons that we can learn today from this man of God? One is encouraged at a number of levels. What I like is the fact that he was very interested in human rights. He tried to defend the rights of the Huguenots. He was a man of the arts and tried to use his faith to do literature such as poems and plays. But he was a man of great intellect who wanted to write on pastoral and theological subjects. He was a man not hiding away from the world, but heavily trying to do his best in the political stage. But he was a man of education who helped to train many pastors and preachers. But above all, he was a man faithful to Christ. A man who believed that Jesus Christ died for his sins. And above all his work and all that he did, it was to promote his King and to promote the gospel of salvation. I trust that this little talk upon Beza will be a help in your ministry and in your walk with the Lord. God bless you.